This week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, and it can be translated as rulings, ordinances, judgments. Right? This is the context. We're basically going to be hit with a bunch of rules. Okay? And this gets interesting because like all the Torah portions, how much time do you want to spend in one evening to unpack it all, right? So that's kind of why we just kind of hit some of the highlights, and we'll try to do that as we go through over and over again, and maybe by the time the Lord returns, we'll have gone sufficiently enough to glean what he's trying to tell us, hopefully. But that's our role. Anyway, so in the story up to this point, if you will, the people had just gotten the revelation from Sinai, right? They've been given the 10 Commandments. They've seen God has pulled them out of Egypt. He's appeared on the mountain in the cloud and the thunder, and all this stuff's going on, right? And so God legislates a series of laws for the people, right? Because you don't want to have disorder. It's like, I pulled you out of paganism, told you can't live that way anymore, so I'm going to start to show you how I want you to live. Okay? Now, Mishpatim contains 53 new commands, right, up to this point in our progressing story. There are 23 imperative and 30 prohibitions. So basically, 23, you shall do this, and 30, you shall not do this. Okay? And we're not going to talk about every one of those because there's a lot in there. You definitely have to read it, though, because there's a lot that applies to us, right, in our daily life, in our daily walk. We can't just assume that we're so far removed because of our modern conveniences that these things don't apply anymore. But the thread that I want to pick up on in this Torah portion is that the very core of Mishpatim deals with the issue of obedience. Okay? I would say obedience is the primary focus of this Torah portion. And I didn't really see it that way the first time I went through. But the more I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, I think that's the message. Maybe it's just the message for today, I don't know. But that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So, entering into the covenant has a prerequisite of obedience. Okay? We have to choose today to obey regardless of our understanding. Right? I don't presume to understand everything about Torah. I'm still learning. There's a lot of things about everything that I don't understand. Right? I don't understand why there's certain traffic laws in place, but yet I'm obliged to obey them or suffer the consequences. Right? So just because we don't have understanding does not absolve us of our responsibility to be obedient. Now, understanding can nurture obedience, right? It's easier to obey when I understand. You tell me not to do something, and then you tell me the reason why. Oh, okay, I can get behind that. But genuine obedience does not require understanding. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So, the law, right? It's this big, ugly word, right? We've all been taught the law, right? Don't mess with the law stuff. It's going to bring you under a curse. It's not for today. It's bondage. It's legalism. The law. Stay away from the law, right? What is the law? Well, an overview. 613 commands, right? Now, some would say, that's a lot. I have to observe all of that, make sure I'm minding my P's and Q's, and 613 commands. I will challenge you to look up how many traffic laws are on the books, how many civil laws are on the books for the area you live in. Look at your ordinances and rules regarding your township, right? Like what you can do in your backyard. 613 is not that many. It's really not. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So we have 613 commands. Now, keep in mind, Some of these commands revolve around the temple, which we do not currently have. Right? So we could take those off the table for argument's sake. Some of these commands apply to women only. Some apply to men only. Okay? Some are only applicable in certain situations. Right? When you find yourself in this particular circumstance, this is how you are to react, etc., etc. So, now these 613 commands are made up of 3 basic groups. And we've talked about this before. It's hukim, which are statutes and ordinances. Now, these are not obvious or rational. Okay? These are the things that on the surface do not make sense. God says it, and it's like, I don't even understand that. For example, he told Moses to speak to the rock. Moses wants some water, right? He needs water for the people. And what does God say? Speak to the rock. How am I going to get water by talking to a rock, God? This doesn't make sense. Okay? And then when the people were sick, he tells them to look at the bronze serpent, right? Make a bronze serpent. Everybody's been bitten by venomous snakes. Make a bronze serpent, and then if you look at it, you'll be healed. These things don't make sense to our rational minds. Right. But yet, when the people obeyed, right, in the case of the bronze serpent, they were healed. Right. So that's hukim. Now, idot, or witness, these are symbolic laws. Our holy days would fall under this. Our festivals would fall under this. They're symbolic, right? It's not just a day on a calendar. It's not just an event. It symbolizes something. The same thing with our tzitzits, our tassels, right? This little piece of string does nothing for me spiritually, right? This is not going to get me into heaven, right? This is not going to, well, it should stop me from sinning. That's his point. But it's a symbol. It's symbolic, right? In the natural, it's just a piece of fabric. But it's symbolic. It means something deeper. And then the third category is mishpatim, or judgments. And that's what we're talking about here in our Torah portion. And these are obvious, logical, and rational laws, right? These things make sense. And if you tuck this away, when you read through this Torah portion, think about the civil laws in our country that you're familiar with. You will see a lot of parallels. You'll see a lot of parallels. And the reason for that is because much of our civil laws in this country are based off of these biblical principles. And they're still in effect today. You know, the founding fathers were steeped in biblical thinking. Was it Hebraic? Probably not. But yet they were still reading Scripture, looking at Scripture to inform them as to how to govern the country. How do we set this nation up? And that's why a lot of these laws, they're still on the books today. Mishpatim, these judgments, these ordinances, these rules. Really what we're talking about is application. And when we are obedient to the specific application, whatever it may be, it shows two things. It shows our allegiance to the higher principles. Talking about the 10 Commandments, right? So we're saying we're showing allegiance by being obedient. It's also a commitment to the larger system, i.e. the covenant, that we're choosing to be a part of. So when I'm obedient, I'm connecting to something greater than myself. I'm connecting to God's ordinances, right? But by connecting to His ordinances, I'm connecting to God Himself. So it's not just observance for observance sake. It's not just obedience for obedience sake. Just so I can pat myself on the back and say I did a good job today. I'm connecting to the Creator. Because these are His laws. And He has the best interest for me. He wants to see me succeed. He wants to see me do well. He wants to see me thrive. And not just for my sake, because I represent him.
Amen.
We all do. We have that capacity to represent the creator of the universe. It's not a small thing. Now, we go through, and one of the first laws, and I'll just briefly mention this, chapter 21, verse 5. Actually, no. Verse 2, excuse me. It says, if you purchase a Hebrew slave, and that should be rendered bondservant or indentured servant, if you look up the history of this. We're not talking about, a lot of times we think of slavery in the context of more of our American history with slavery. But in this time period, it was going to be closer, not exclusively. They did have slavery as we would understand it. But by and large, slavery was actually indentured servitude, right? So we would call that employment today, basically. But anyway, it says, if you purchase a Hebrew slave, he is to work 6 years, but in the 7th, he is to be given his freedom without having to pay anything. Now, it's interesting that this Torah portion opens with that passage. Right out of the get-go, we're talking about slaves. And we'll see when we get into our half-Torah why that is. So just tuck that away for a moment. But as we continue to read, we go through a bunch of other laws and things like that and all this stuff. And then we get to this often quoted passage in verse 23. Says, if any harm follows, then you are to give life for life, eye for an eye, and tooth for a tooth. And it goes on. Everybody likes to quote that. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? Whatever you do to me, I'm going to at least do that back to you. Okay? Now, what's interesting, this Hebrew idiom, if you look at the Talmud, was never to be taken literally. Okay? If somebody gets injured and they lose their eye, you don't take the offender's eye out. Right? We're talking about a whole level of barbarism here. That was just not part of that culture. So what's really going on? Well, there was a financial burden on the part of the aggressor. That's what they're talking about here. And damages were to be paid monetarily. Okay? It's interesting because they had 5 areas to recover, right? So the attacker was responsible for medical, lost wages, projected wages lost, and for pain and suffering, among others. Which sounds very similar to what would happen if I went to court and sued somebody, right? They're going to have to pay me for time off work, they're going to have to pay me for my lost wages, my hospital bills, right? Pain and suffering, all these things are on the table. This is where that comes from. Now the idiom suggests eye for an eye. It suggests that is how you determine the value of what is to be paid out, of the recompense, right? What is the value of your eye, right? You did something and you damaged somebody's eye. What's that worth to you? That's what you should pay that person, right? What's the value of your tooth getting knocked out? Are you suffering harm? Having to lose, time off work and all kinds of other things, right? So that's kind of the gist of what that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's not license for revenge, okay? It's like, what if somebody did that to you, how would you want to be compensated? That's your responsibility. Now, we're going to jump ahead. Chapter 22, we get a bunch more rules. And we come to chapter 23. And we have a few more rules here and things like that. Let me see if I can find this, because this gets really interesting. Yeah, verse 20. So we have all these rules and these things talking about festivals and so on. And then God says, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you on the way, to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him, listen to what he says, and do not rebel. Do not rebel against him, because he will not forgive any wrongdoing of yours, since my name resides in him. And then verse 22, this gets really interesting. It says, but if you listen to what he says, talking about the angel, and do everything I tell you, God himself, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and a foe to your foes. When my angel goes ahead of you and brings you to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Kenites, all these, and I will make an end of them. So this is really interesting. Who is this angel? Right? So Moses is talking to God, and God says, look, I'm going to send an angel to kind of go before you. Make sure you guys don't have any issues as you go towards the promised land. So the Hebrew word for angel is Malach, and it carries the idea of a messenger, right? One who carries a message. Now, as Messianic believers, our position is that this angel is none other than Yeshua himself in some type of pre-incarnate form. Okay? Now, this gets interesting. That's our position, and here's the defense. Verse 23, or chapter 23, verse 21, says, do not be rebellious against him, for he will not forgive your transgressions. What is a transgression? What does Scripture say is a transgression, or i.e. sin? It's violation of God's law, of the Torah.
Right.
That's the definition of sin.
Transgression of the law.
Now, disregard for the law is lawlessness, and it's the domain of those who hate authority. Again, we come back to the issue of obedience. Now, I was thinking about that verse, two masters. You can't serve two masters, right? You'll love one and you'll hate the other. You'll be obedient to one and you'll be disobedient to the other. Right? Now, chapter 23, verse 22. It says, for if you fully listen to his voice, the angel, and do all which I speak, God. What is God speaking here? He's just given us a whole bunch of the law. Right? So, what does this angel say? If this angel is Yeshua, what did Yeshua say? Right? Because remember, we have to obey the voice of this angel. Yeshua said, love God, love man. Right? Matthew 22:36. All the law and the prophets rest on these two things. Right? And then God says, do all that I speak, the Torah and the commandments. Now, Yeshua's commands, we call that the law of Christ. And a lot of times we take that statement and we use that as an argument to dismiss the law, which is not appropriate. And if you guys have an outline, I put the word summary there. That really should say foundation. I think that's a better word. But the law of Christ is not just this overarching summary. It is that. But it's also the foundation of the Torah law. If I could take all 613 laws, I could boil them down into two categories. Love God, love man.
Right.
That's what Yeshua was talking about.
Right.
He wasn't saying only do those two. How do I know how to do those two things?
Right.
Right? Maybe me loving my neighbor is not knocking his teeth out. Love you, bro. Right? I've got no context. It's whatever I feel like. And if everybody does whatever they feel like, that's
Sounds like the day and
lawlessness.
age we live in.
Yeah, it's lawlessness, it's anarchy. So Yeshua's command, i.e. the law of Christ, is the foundation of the Torah. And it's that his statement was given on the basis that his hearers, not our Western culture, the culture he was speaking to, would have a familiarity with the Torah law.
Right.
They'd be like, oh yeah, you could take all the Torah and you could boil it down into two categories. Love God and love man.
Right.
Oh, that makes total sense. Yeshua is affirming the Torah. He's affirming the law. How do you love God? The Torah tells you. How do you love your fellow man? The Torah tells you.
Right. Good.
So you can't fulfill the law of Christ without the foundation of the law. That dirty, ugly word that nobody likes to talk about. It's foundational. It's important.
It is.
So, this angel as Yeshua. So what does that mean for us today? Right? Because we're not in the desert, we're not at the foot of Mount Sinai. Okay? We're in Holland, Michigan. We must follow Yeshua, who affirmed and elevated the Father's commands. And we follow him to the promised land of God's kingdom by obeying him completely. And what did Yeshua say? Love God, love man.
That's great.
Right? How do we do that? Torah, law.
Yeah.
Now, I know this might fly in the face of some people when I'm saying that there's a prerequisite to coming into the covenant. Because what are we taught? You don't have to do anything. Yeshua paid the price. He did all the work. And he did. But that doesn't mean there's no responsibility.
Right.
Okay? The covenant is there. It exists. We have to choose it. We have to accept it. How do we do that? Obedience. Okay? I'll show you where we're going here. Exodus 24, verse 7 and 8. Actually, let me start at 24, verse 4. Moses wrote down all the words of Adonai. He rose early in the morning, built an altar at the base of the mountain, and set upright 12 large stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent the young men of the people of Israel to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings of oxen to Adonai. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. The other half of the blood he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud, i.e. the Torah, the law, so that the people could hear. And they responded, "Everything that Adonai has spoken, we will do and obey." Right? So they were presented with the law, presented with the covenant. Then what happened? Then Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant which Adonai has made with you in accordance with all these words." What do we know about biblical history? That covenants are sealed with blood. Right? The people affirmed their obedience to the covenant prior to being sealed with blood. They weren't in the covenant. It was presented. They had to choose. And once they made that choice, they were sealed with blood. Parallels. If covenants are sealed with blood, Yeshua sealed his people into the Father's covenant with his perfect blood. He did his part. Our responsibility is to say, "I accept that. And by my acceptance of that, I will be obedient to it." And that is where we come with the argument that obedience is prior to the covenant. It's our responsibility. Now, this verse has some interesting phraseology in it in verse 7. At the tail end, it says, everything that Adonai has spoken, we will do and obey. That phrase, we will do and obey, that's Na'esh v'nishma in Hebrew. And there's 4 views of this. There's 4 kind of rabbinical viewpoints on the phrase. The first is, do then hear. So it's an expression of total faith in God. They accepted the covenant even before they heard its terms. Now, this is probably the weakest of the views, because we know that they've already gotten the 10 Commandments, and then they've just heard all that law, okay? But do then hear, that's one viewpoint. The next is, we will do and we will obey. And the idea is that they will do what has already been commanded and obey all future commands to respond faithfully indeed. Or the third one is, we will obediently do. They would do what God asks of them because they sought to do his will. That should be the same for us. Because we seek to do his will, we will be obedient, even though we might not have full understanding. And the last one, we will do and we will understand. Placing doing, i.e. obedience, before understanding. The doing leads to understanding. Right? The more I obey the law, the more I submit my life to the law and try to keep it as best as I'm able, the more I understand about the law, and the more because that connects me to the Father, the more I understand about the Father's character and who he is. So the overarching idea, regardless of which viewpoint you kind of gravitate to, is that one is ready to respond with action or obedience prior to complete understanding. And you get this picture of a child. You know, I was thinking of my sons. I tell them to do something. And there's those rare times where they'll do it, just because I said it, even though they don't understand. And sometimes they'll ask why, but that's usually after the fact, right? They know that as the father, I expect them to be obedient. And if they're not, there's consequences. But a lot of times I'm telling them to do stuff, they're 10 and 11, 12 years old. All right? They don't have the level of maturity and understanding that a parent would have. And so we say, go do this, go do that thing, get this done. Why? I was telling about shoveling the driveway, how I'm like, whenever you can, you want to shovel it down to the pavement, right? Why? Because that just seems like extra work. Well, what happens is, soon enough, that little bit of snow that you leave on there turns to a solid sheet of ice. Now you're falling on your butt. So whenever you can, get it down to the raw pavement. So things like that, but they'll be obedient even without understanding. And then you can give understanding later. Oh yeah, that makes total sense. Right? Now our half Torah in Jeremiah. We're going to go all the way to Jeremiah 33. Actually, it should be 34 verses 8. I think we're going to start there. Now, let me read a few verses here. This word came to Jeremiah from Adonai after King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people in Jerusalem to emancipate them. Everyone who had a male or female slave who was a Hebrew was to let him go free. None was to keep as his slave a fellow Jew. All the leaders and the people listened who had entered into the covenant, wherein everyone was to free his male and female slaves and not keep them in bondage any longer. Freedom for everybody. They listened and they let them go, but afterwards they changed their minds. They made the male and female slaves whom they had freed return, and they brought them back into subjection as slaves. And then the passage goes on where God punished them accordingly. Now this is a connection all the way back to the first part of our Torah portion. right? Where it talked about the slaves. You have to free them after 6 years. So, what was going on? So Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, kind of covers this turbulent time period when Babylon twice invaded Judah, 598 and 587 BC, right? Blame for these events is placed on Judah's failed leadership. That's what we're talking about here in this passage. Now, just like Mishpatim opens with the commandments about releasing slaves, Jeremiah reports how the people of Judah betrayed the slaves of their day. And this was during the first temple period. But King Zedekiah, he sees that Babylon's coming. And so he's praying. He's like, we need some help. Babylon's coming for us. This is not looking good. And so he's like, you know what? Let's release all the slaves, right? Because it's past 6 years. So let's get some favor with God, and maybe if we do this, then God will kind of cover our butts with Babylon. And it seemed like it worked, right? The slaves were freed, Babylon lost interest, I don't know, moved on, whatever. And then the crisis is over. People are breathing a sigh of relief. And all of a sudden, guys are like, whoa, I lost a lot of my workforce. We better go get those guys back. And so the former slave owners reneged and took back all their slaves. And God's like, whoa. You know, he sent Jeremiah to correct them. He said, what are you doing? You freed the slaves and then you're taking them back? You're going back on your word. You're breaking your covenant. You're breaking a vow. And so God says, you know what? It's judgment. And Babylon came and took the people. But it was Jeremiah's response was to proclaim God's judgment, and which was the downfall of the nation at the hands of the Babylonians. Now, Jeremiah 33 was later added. It wasn't always part of this Torah portion. But over time, they added this. Let's go there and read it. So 33, 25, and 26. Here's what Adonai says, if I have not established my covenant with day and night and fixed the laws for sky and earth, then I will also reject the descendants of Jacob and my servant David, not choosing from his descendants people to rule over the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for I will cause their captives to come back and I will show them compassion. So the sages added this. They're like, man, that word from Jeremiah is harsh. We need to remind the people that God is compassionate. Right? You're going to get a spanking. You're going to get driven out. You'll come back, and I'll show you compassion. And this is good for us because we're human. We're going to break God's laws. Hard as we might try. Right? Everyone's fallen short. But we do have grace, and we do have mercy, and we have compassion, because those are the nature of the God that we serve. Now, that does not give us license to disregard the law, to disregard his commands, right? How many of us ever got stopped for speeding? And the officer looks at our information and is like, all right, slow it down for me next time. Hand your stuff back and you go up the road. That's grace. He doesn't have to do that. He's well within his rights to issue a ticket. Just like God is well within his rights to bring punishment. But it's up to his discretion if he wants to show grace and mercy. All right, the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 and 42. So now, we have Yeshua talking about, you have heard, verse 38, you have heard that our fathers were told, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, not to stand up against someone who does you wrong. On the contrary, if someone hits you on the right cheek, let him hit you on the left cheek too. If someone wants to sue you for your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And if a soldier forces you to carry his pack for 1 mile, carry it for 2. When someone asks you for something, give it to him. When someone wants to borrow something from you, lend it to him. What is Yeshua talking about here? Right? Because up to this point, we have eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We have this whole system of recompense for the victims. And here comes Yeshua just messing everything up. Right? What's he talking about here? So Yeshua brings a new ethic to the interpretation of an eye for an eye. Remember, it's not a literal thing, right? But he's raising this, he's elevating this, right? Because what's the standard? All right, I hurt you and I damage your eye, I damage your tooth, for lack of a comparison. And okay, an eye is, if it was my eye, this is what I would pay, and this is what we're going to do, right? Done. I can go home, right? I did what I was supposed to do. Yeshua says, wait a minute. He doesn't absolve us of our responsibility under the law, right? We violated someone, we hurt someone, the law says we have to pay. That still remains, that does not go away. But he elevates our response, right? We are to rid ourselves of the spirit of retaliation. Man, I know I did something to hurt somebody, but they went all around town telling everybody, right? They've been dragging my name through the dirt, and they've been talking it up, and it's not even that bad. Why should I'm going to show them. We rid ourselves of the spirit of retaliation. We need to be unconcerned about personal insults and injuries that provoke us to defend our self-esteem. How often do we see this? Right? Disputes among neighbors. Man, that old tree that you had finally fell, and it fell in my yard and broke my fence. Now you got to fix my fence. And you're such a jerk because you allowed your tree to break my fence. Well, no, you're a jerk. You shouldn't put that fence under my tree. Right? And we get these attitudes going. We can't go there. We have to look beyond our own self-interest and offer more grace in the response than we have received. That's what Yeshua is talking about. He doesn't say if you hurt someone, the law has a standard. But let's take it higher. Right? So, I've hurt somebody, I've offended somebody, and I have a responsibility to make it right. So I go do that. I don't do it begrudgingly. I have to do it. Right? It's the law. I get to do it. I have a chance to make amends with somebody that I've wronged. That's what Yeshua is talking about. Take your attitude and, just like carrying that soldier's pack, go the extra mile. You don't have to. But think about it. A Roman soldier had the ability to take anyone he saw. You, carry my gear. And if you refuse, he could probably take you out right there, or he'd have you hauled off. So what do? You take his gear. You're not happy about it, right? But what happens? All right, you carried it for a mile, get out of here. No, I'll carry it for another mile for you. What? What kind of person are you? This is what we're talking about. Being different. Elevating our responses above just our mere responsibility. Now, in verse 38, Yeshua says, you have heard that our fathers were told, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you. So now the people are looking at Yeshua like, who's this dude? What kind of authority does he have? What do you mean, you tell us? right? Our sages, our rabbis, Moses brought us this law. And you're just going to come and just change stuff? Who are you? Scripture answers this for us. Moses gave the Torah from Mount Sinai as a mediator between the people and the Lord, between the people and the Father, Hashem. We had Moses, we had the prophets, we had the apostles. But our final mediator is Yeshua. He stood upon the Mount of Transfiguration with Moses and with Elijah. That scene right there demonstrated, at a minimum, he's peers with these three. The minimum standards, he's equal, right? The fact that he's transfigured before everybody, I would suggest, elevates him quite a bit. So, to those who were there and saw that fixed it in their mind, he's the Messiah. He does have the authority to change these things. All that stuff that he said before he was crucified, he had absolute authority. And then what happens? If all that wasn't enough, you hear the voice of God saying, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." I don't know what more greater validation you could give to somebody, right? Literally the voice of God says, "That's my man." So we have God's voice, Moses and Elijah, validating Yeshua as the Messiah. And that's where he gets the authority to elevate the law. He doesn't dismiss the law. He elevates it. He elevates our response in it, our connection to it. And if anything, when we have these understandings that he gave us and the law, it deepens our connection with the Father, the lawgiver. So in closing, Mishpatim not only provides us with God's ordinances, but it underscores the priority of obedience. Obedience and righteous living. And this way we connect ourselves to God's covenant. We connect ourselves to the lawgiver. Okay? So we have a responsibility. We can't claim that we are connected to the Father, that we know him, and yet we disregard his law. That paints a picture. Imagine if that was a natural child and a natural parent, right? "I love you, Dad. I'm not going to do anything you tell me to do. I'm not going to obey your rules, and I'm going to disrespect your house. But I love you. Can you bless me? Can you give me some stuff?" That's a spoiled, rotten brat who deserves punishment. That's what that is. Rebellion reveals our unwillingness to come under God's authority. That's really the issue. If I know what God expects of me and I'm refusing to do it, that's rebellion. And why am I rebelling? Because I really don't want, in my heart of hearts, I don't want somebody over me telling me what to do. I'm going to tell me what to do. I'm my own boss, the master of my destiny. Who does God think he is to tell me what to do? Rebellion reveals our unwillingness to come under God's authority. And that same rebellion, taken to its logical conclusion, is hatred. You can't serve two masters. You will love one and you will hate the other. It's hatred for the things of the Lord. And that will separate you from the promises of God's covenant. Obedience. It's key. It's primary. It's a priority. We can't just take these like, oh, that was just for those Jews. That was just for those guys coming out of Egypt way back in the day. That's all under the blood. It's at the foot of the cross. I love you, Dad. I'm not going to do anything you tell me to do. I don't know. When I have to stand before the throne of judgment at some point, like we all will, I'm going to have enough in my life to answer for. I'm going to do my darndest while I'm alive to not have to answer for breaking all of his laws. Maybe some of them. The choice is ours. Nobody can force obedience. You have to decide for yourself. What do you want to accept? Who do you want to serve? Do you want to serve yourself? Do you want to serve the Father? Because you can't do both. You'll love one and you will hate the other. I hope you all found that beneficial tonight. I know I learn a lot every time we go through these Torah portions, and it really does connect you to the Father. The more that we learn, the more that we grow, and the more that we're obedient to, the deeper and more meaningful our faith will become. Of that I am sure.